finals, they're all due in 24 hours, and I still have 25% of that course left to finish, so I'm going to start on time today. Also, for what it's worth, I forgot that this was happening until 8:56 my time. I actually got a GCal reminder. So if that gives you, as of next week, things will be calmer, but let's get to it. So last time on DrugsCo, we started off kind of getting through a lot of or at least a portion of the psychedelics section. And rest assured, this is not the only time we're going to be talking about psychedelics in this class. This is just kind of an introduction to the concept, and we're going to come back a little bit later, not only talking more about the social, cultural, political backgrounds and traditional uses of psychedelics, especially naturally occurring ones, but also into trip sitting and the actual psychedelic experience, which I think is a very nebulous thing that a lot of people have a bit of trouble understanding if they don't have firsthand experience with psychedelics. So rest assured that we will come back to all those things. For now, I just want you guys to kind of get an overview of what are known as classical psychedelics, and I'll define that in a second. So last time, just to backtrack a little bit, we kind of briefly went over the concepts of microdosing and ego death and mental illness, and how mental illness could potentially be exacerbated or alleviated by psychedelics, and there's a lot of emerging research in those areas, to the concept of flashbacks as being largely a media trope that are not actually that common with psychedelics. And it's not to say that they can't happen. My personal theory is that they are more the reflection of having PTSD flashbacks from intense, frightening psychedelic experiences, as opposed to traditionally what's called acid flashbacks or whatever else. However, I can't support that theory. And if people have conflicting views, then shoot me an email and we can talk. Also, a note, I have received quite a few messages and emails in the last week from a lot of people in this class. I have intentionally not opened or answered any of them because I'm currently doing finals and want to be able to give everyone my full attention when I do respond. So I'm not ignoring you. I am going to get around to all of those messages, and I'm glad that people have questions. I apologize for the delay. I just want to make sure I can do it right, as an aside. So moving on to synesthesia, which we touched on briefly last time as well. And this is something that a lot of people had questions on, so I'll elaborate a little bit today. But synesthesia can be more of a nebulous kind of topic, because we still don't have a very concrete understanding of what causes synesthesia in people with and without psychedelics. With psychedelics, it's a little bit more straightforward, right? It's just that different regions of the brain that are responsible for sensory processing and perception are communicating in ways that they wouldn't normally. So for instance, if I asked you, how does the number 9 feel to you? Most people would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But some people, and some people particularly only under the influence of psychedelics, would be like, oh, 9 is like bright red and powerful and also has like an androgynous energy to it. And for some people that might make perfect sense. And if you're like, I have no idea why you would say something like that, then that's kind of like an interesting delineating factor between synesthesia and not synesthesia. So we can talk about that if you're curious offsite. So all of the substances that we're about to look at today are Schedule 1 drugs. So they've been deemed by the US government to have a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical value, which I'm not going to say anything else on because I think you probably know my feelings on this already, but we'll come back to those things later again. In terms of why they're used in the first place, I think that a really common sentiment, I'm like out of breath today. Finals, man, they really get you. I think that a very common sentiment among people that don't understand psychedelics is, why would people choose to use that in the first place? I don't get it. That just seems like such a risk. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I would say that some of the major reasons people would use psychedelics in the first place are either because they're curious. I mean, like, let's face it, they're really fascinating. Even if you're not into them, like the concept of a psychedelic in the first place is very strange, right? And they are strange substances. Like psychedelics get super weird. And on top of that, if you know a little bit more about psychedelics, then people might be interested in them for the purpose of personal development. So curiosity and personal development, either overcoming challenges or simply trying to use psychedelics as a tool for one reason or another. And again, remember that's known as an entheogen, is a substance that's used with the intention of personal or spiritual development. So many psychedelics fall under the category of entheogens. They're not always used as entheogens. So it kind of depends on the context. Then, of course, there's partying. A lot of people enjoy partying on psychedelics. A lot of people cannot fathom partying on psychedelics. There is no shame in falling into the latter category, especially if you work or play in environments that are very psychedelic heavy, like raves and burns and other counterculture communities. There can be a lot of like kind of weird covert pressure to do psychedelics as a social activity. The fact is, a lot of people just cannot. There's like no shame whatsoever in that. Or also, there's something that psychedelics do, which is basically make an environment that may otherwise feel very familiar to you all of a sudden feel unfamiliar. Someplace that you've been 150 times before in the past might have qualities to it that are new or unusual. So even just tripping in your bedroom, like your bedroom feels like a different space. It doesn't necessarily look like it's transforming into an Alice in Wonderland environment. That's a very media stereotype, but it will feel different. Like the, dare I say it, the vibe of your room might be different. And the people that you're with as well. Really mixes things up. Then for spiritual or religious purposes, psychedelics are used in those contexts quite frequently, particularly naturally occurring psychedelics, like mushrooms in particular have a very rich history. Mescaline containing plants have a very rich history. And that one we're going to touch on more in a later lecture because there's a lot to unpack there with the spiritual and religious purposes of which psychedelics are used. So we're not going to try and get too deep into that right now because it's kind of a lot, it's very nuanced. This is an outdated graph. I would have gone in and updated it, but I'm drowning in my own schoolwork, so it hasn't happened yet. So take this graph with a grain of salt. As of 2014, approximately 0.2 to 0.3% of people under the age of 26 currently use psychedelics. And you can see here that like this graph is probably largely still ballpark accurate. I think that the most recent figure was that approximately 32 million people are current psychedelic users, but I'm not positive on that, so don't quote me. I'll get back to you. But largely, like there is kind of like, I don't even want to say, I don't even know if they're basing this off of like sex or gender when they say males and females. So we're going to just kind of like say that there may exist a social divide in who uses psychedelics. And just generally in drugs altogether, that males, I'm not even sure what the metric is because drug studies are so poor in their design and because they just can't get funded. There is a social delineator there for sure. But also in terms of age ranges, people in their like mid to late 20s and early 30s are the most prevalent group of users of psychedelics. Now, I used to have different safety profiles for all the different classical psychedelics, but I decided to condense them. And the reason is that, generally speaking, classical psychedelics, which is a set of drugs that act on a specific serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor, have relatively similar safety profiles, right? So we can generalize this somewhat. In terms of direct deaths from psychedelics, there aren't really recorded direct deaths from psychedelics. Like in terms of even something like LSD toxicity, there are reports of people taking like 1,000 hits of acid. And sure, I mean, they might suffer some psychological consequences thereafter, but people don't really die from taking psychedelics. The reason that people might die from taking a psychedelic is complication deaths. And that can involve things like behavioral accidents. So for instance, a couple of years ago at a festival that I was working, Lightning in a Bottle, someone climbed to the top of an art structure while they were tripping on acid and jumped off. And you know, that is something that's overinflated by the media. However, I personally also know people whose friends have been on a roof and said, I can fly. And like, it's not very common, but high doses of psychedelics or psychedelic experiences that aren't properly planned or people just happen to have a difficult experience, like you should probably have someone that's sober on hand just in case. The only other real situation where someone might die partly traceable to psychedelics is suicides. And this is a really kind of a non-factor here because there are a couple of rare incident reports of people who will have a traumatizing experience on psychedelics and commit suicide thereafter. However, there is so much conflating data there, like that person's mental health history, whether or not they were prepared to take psychedelics, whether or not they were on other drugs, whether or not their behavioral and environmental situations were stacking up to this. So this is a really huge thing that's been used in propaganda effectively in the past to say like, oh, well, people often have such traumatizing experiences on psychedelics that they commit suicide. And that's simply not the case. As with any experience that involves intense emotion, like it's possible to have adverse psychological effects from psychedelics. However, with effective set and setting, taking into consideration your mental health history, your family history, the environment you're doing it in, you can really minimize those risks. They're still existent though, for sure, but you don't really die from toxicity of psychedelics. You don't get withdrawals from psychedelics. You don't become addicted to psychedelics. The one thing that can happen in some rare cases is psychological dependence, basically. And it's not the same as addiction, and we'll get into the distinction of that a little bit later in the course. But psychological dependence is effectively alleviating mental health symptoms in the presence of a drug. And then if you stop doing that drug, or you've started to use that drug as a crutch in layman's terms, then that can bring on psychological dependence. So you feel as though that drug becomes kind of an integral part of your routine. And this isn't necessarily addiction, like not necessarily. Addiction is it has a lot of very neurological components that are a consequence of social components. But psychological dependence is really the only thing that's reported for something like classical psychedelics, and even that is very rare. So let me know if anyone has questions, clarifying questions on that, because I know it's a little bit of a gray area. Come back to this. Big question, do classical psychedelics damage the brain or body? And the answer is no, they don't. Unequivocally, they just don't. If you eat a ton of cactus that contains mescaline, you might feel really nauseous and throw up. And if you have IBS, you're probably going to have a hard time digesting the fiber. But from a toxicity profile, like they simply do not cause damage to your brain or body, as far as we're aware, at least, to my knowledge. The risks here are more long-term psychological behavioral changes, and these really only happen in a negative context, either from people that have had a really adverse reaction psychologically to psychedelics and have had a traumatizing experience, to people who have existing mental health conditions, who are predisposed to mental health conditions, or in some cases, people who just go balls to the wall with psychedelics and do them so frequently that their behavior starts changing. And I'm not going to deny the fact that that's possible. You know, if any of you are familiar with the term fry ball, like it's true that a lot of wooks at a lot of festivals that do acid like every day for years will act differently. But the thing is that there are also very high functioning people who can do that and not have necessarily adverse effects. Like I'm personally acquainted with people that take psychedelics like multiple times a week, like full doses of psychedelics multiple times a week, and are extremely high functioning and behaviorally sound. So this really is something where like it's not easy to like directly categorizing. Shark says, one little known effect, you'll start using the word energy a lot more. That is true. It does get you invested in crystals, let me tell you. And also, this can have an impact on mental illness. This is a very complicated subject matter, honestly, and the relationship between psychedelics and mental health is still something that we're currently trying to understand. The general baseline of what I will say is that, as with many substances, and as I've said before with psychedelics, your mindset that you go into this with, and the setting that you choose to put yourself in are two of the biggest determining factors in whether or not your psychedelic experience has the potential to cause mental health concerns. So establishing a safe and effective behavioral use pattern for yourself, as well as checking in with people about your use, being educated about your use, will all reduce the risks affiliated with psychedelics. You are not going to die from taking psychedelics. It's just not going to happen. In some rare cases, if you have a medication interaction, you could face consequences and complications. Yeah, that's the one. So always be sure to check your interactions before taking psychedelics, and do be aware that psychedelics lower your seizure threshold And other drugs also lower your seizure threshold. So be very aware of that if you are seizure prone, if you're epileptic, like these are all the things that you need to know about. So sometimes someone that does not have a prior history of seizures will be on an SSRI and take psychedelics, which can, you know, it might dull the effects for some people, but you might still be able to trip, but that might really increase your risk of having a seizure. So these are all things to take into consideration here. And if anyone's curious about safer dosing for psychedelics or understanding how your risk profile stacks up, then talk to me and we can figure that out together. Kind of lightly, you know, not a doctor. So let's look at acid, lysergic acid dithylamide. So the average dose for LSD or acid is 80 to 150 micrograms. That's this symbol. I mean, this isn't the correct U, it's like a sciencey U, but micrograms is tiny, okay? Let me drill that home in a second. Acid is also known as Lucy or fries or tabs. Frying is apparently a very West Coast thing, as I learned a couple of years ago. Yes, in the chat, the sciencey micro U has been posted. Thank you. Also known as dots and window pane. Window pane is a term for a sheet of gel tabs. And gel tabs I'll show in a second. But a window pane is basically just like, for any tabs of any kind, usually they'll initially come in what's called a sheet. So this, for instance, right here might be an example of blotter sheet. You can see there are perforations here, and that's why the edges of tabs have perforation, because you need to kind of peel them and tear them apart. If you eat a whole sheet, you're going to be eating many hits of acid. So if someone says, oh, I ate a window pane, they're going to be really goddamn high, probably very soon. So if you've ever met anyone that's on a window pane, you know. Also, a regional thing, doing acid is sometimes known as frying. Or flying is more of a boomery term, I think, and then tripping is just like the colloquial thing. People get very creative with how they refer to their acid. On the West Coast, at least, you might be like, hey, I've got some leftover fries in my fridge. You want to come over and grab some ketchup? And that's the sneaky, non-cop oriented way to talk about it, which does not really do it. So here's a closer look at blotter or tabs. You can see the perforations there. Now, generally when people are dropping acid on these blotters, it'll be in the form of liquid, and that's what it's synthesized as. It's primarily synthesized as, actually, I think it's crystalline first and then liquid. I'm not positive on that one. If anyone knows, let me know. Let's see, survey says nothing. Okay. So when you're dropping liquid LSD, often the technique that's used is called needle point. So you'll basically take a needle and dip it in the liquid, which has been measured out so that one drop contains a certain number of micrograms. And you have to keep in mind here, if 1 milligram is about the size of a grain of sand, then 100 micrograms is about a tenth of the size of a grain of sand. So if I show you, there are gel tabs, if I show you powder, otherwise known as fluff down here, and I tell you that that's all LSD, thinking about what you know as one dose of acid being a tenth of the size of a grain of sand, this is millions of hits of acid, millions of hits in just this like little bit of fluff, of powder. So in order to dose acid, part of the reason that you can almost never rely on what your dealer says these tabs are dosed as, like truly just trust me. If your dealer's like, oh, they're 87 mics, unless your dealer is the one that laid this needle point, I don't think they know what they're saying, honestly, because generally it's very difficult to get that kind of precision. So dip the needle into the liquid, drop it onto the tab, and it kind of spreads out and absorbs into the water paper, and then you have to let it dry. You can also drop liquid onto candies, onto mints. That's a very common one. You can drop it onto all kinds of stuff. You can drop it into your eyeball. You can drop it on your hand and lick it off. This is a window pane. You can probably see why it's called window panes for gel tabs. And then with powder and fluff, I have an interesting tale for you all. How many of you have heard, actually, I mean, you can if you want, how many of you have heard that if you touch acid to your skin, you'll get high? That it can be absorbed through your skin.
I believe we had covered in a previous lecture that that actually wasn't true.
Yes.
I'd heard that, but I had heard, but I think we said that wasn't true already.
Yeah, Shark in answer to your question, how do you make a drop an exact size? That's what needlepoint is for. So the idea is that, and in some cases you can use like volumetric dosing where you'll squeeze the little squeezer in there and raise it to a certain level, and it will be a concentration per milliliter or something like that. Needlepoint dosing is more where you literally just stick the needle, collect a drop on the end, and then touch it to the paper. So it depends on kind of the level of science that you're using when you're producing nucleic acid. And that's part of the reason that it can be, sorry?
So it's not like that eyedropper that's in the picture. It's like a different kind of dropping device.
Well, it can be kind of an eyedropper-like device. It depends on what kind of dosing you're used. So if you have an eyedropper, like a pipette, for instance, that has actual milliliter markings on it, then you might be able to use that. Um, and someone says, if you dilute it enough, then the drop size can be approximate. Yes, right. So that is a technique that's often used because it's a lot easier to just use like a full drop instead of trying to have a very hyper concentrated tiny drop. And that's part of why it's easier administered in liquid form, because trying to get one of these crystals onto powder and then it's just, or onto blotter is just not going to work. So fun fact about transdermal absorption of acid, which means absorbing through your skin, are a lot of people are convinced that at some point in time they've had a tab on their skin and they've ended up getting high and like that was it absorbed through their skin. But your skin doesn't quite work like that. Your skin is really good at keeping stuff out, and even though acid is a very small molecule, our current understanding is that and this actually I know from someone who used to hold fluff in his hand while making it, hold millions of hits of acid in his hand while making it, that you could do that while producing LSD and not get high. But the second you touched your hand to your face, to any mucous membrane available on your face, like rubbed it, even got it here and then scratched your nose, you're baked, or you're frying, not baked. So what they would do in the lab is they would actually tie their wrists to their belts so that they couldn't physically raise their hands to touch their face because people would forget and end up having to go home because they were tripping too hard. Now, in terms of the duration of these effects, generally speaking, acid will last approximately 8 to 14 hours. And that's kind of a generous estimate because usually you'll really start coming down around the 7th hour. That's when you start to notice things. And then we should start tying our wrists to protect from COVID. Yeah, it's brilliant. I think people are actually doing that somewhere. And so approximately the 7th or 8th hour, you start really feeling a decrease in the effects. And then from there, they get milder and milder and milder. With acid, you will probably certainly have after effects. You're going to feel a little bit acidic for a while afterwards. I always say that you need 1 day of full recovery, like one full sleep, before you can like really continue doing your thing. You'll be perfectly fine and sober the next day, but I say that from a lot of intense drug experiences, having 2 full sleeps is a really good way of resetting. So sometimes people will have an intense acid trip, they'll wake up the next day and still like remember that trip very strongly and the sensations that came with it, and they'll be like, oh, is this forever now? It's not going to be forever now. It never is, I promise, unless you have like an underlying health condition that's brought out, in which case it would probably be much more obvious than just, I feel a little weird still. Yes, acid does last a very long time. It's true. Not everyone is a big fan of that fact. That's part of the reason that people prefer mushrooms a lot of the time instead, or sometimes. Um, and yes, in terms of you saying not feeling anything the next day, what I'm specifically getting at is you're not tripping the next day, unless you've taken something that's not LSD, or you've taken something that inhibits the breakdown of LSD, but even then it's probably not the case. It's not so much that you're tripped the next day, it's that there's still just a little bit of that like feeling of psychedelia, or just like a very prominent recent memory of that feeling of psychedelia, but you're not tripping. It's a little bit hard to describe. It's called an afterglow in terms of acid, and not everyone experiences it. But in case you do, don't be alarmed. That's normal. If you drop it in your eyeball or other mucous membrane, and yes, you can do this, just make sure that your dilution isn't alcohol-based, because dropping alcohol in your eyes is going to hurt and probably not be good for them. But you can do this, and it does make you come up faster, honestly. Dropping most things directly on your mucous membranes, your eyeballs, in your butthole. Soak in a tampon. Just kidding. Don't do that. Yeah, please don't. It will last the same amount, though. That's Ray. So let's talk about origin stories, right? We recently celebrated Bicycle Day, best holiday of the year. And on April 19th, 1943, this guy, Albert Hofmann, who was a pharmaceutical researcher in Switzerland, synthesized LSD. Real quick, the question is not going to try it, but how would that impact the effects? I think that putting acid vodka in your vagina would maybe like, I'd imagine that it would be similar to boofing, honestly. I don't think it would cause harm, actually. I just don't think it would make much sense. Acid's pretty effective at doing what it does when you just eat it. I'm not going to be the expert on that one. Haven't done it. So Albert Hofmann, pharmaceutical guy in Switzerland, previously had actually identified LSD a couple years prior, I think in 1938. And it was intended to be, I forget exactly what it was. Ray, do you remember what specifically was it a penicillin alternative or something like that?
I don't remember either.
Okay, well, we failed at our jobs. So I failed at my job. You have tenure, you're fine. So he originally synthesized LSD and kind of put it on the back burner, even though he ingested a little bit by accident, was like weird. And then in 1943, he thought, okay, maybe I'll try this again, because why not? I'm Albert Hofmann. And during this time, it was wartime, right? So the buses were shut down. You had to bike or walk home. And so he intentionally ingested 250 micrograms of LSD. Now, let's remember that the average dose is between 80 and 150 mics, approximately. And 150 mics of acid is quite a lot. People that are like, oh, take fat tabs to the face. I could eat 4 or 5 tabs and like not even trip. I would say oftentimes their tabs are just really weak, because most people that think that they have 100 micrograms in their tab, it's more likely that they have like 70 to 80, I would say. That's just a ballpark. A lot of people just have done less acid than they think. 120 to 150 mics of acid is a good hefty dose, let me assure you. And don't fall prey to the competitive acid dosing, because a lot of people do that. But he took 250 mics because he didn't think it would do anything, because that's still a quarter of a grain of sand, right? And after a couple of hours, or like even just an hour, he looks at his assistant and is like, bitch, I'm out. Gets on his bike, canoodles home. And he gets home and he's rolling around on his carpet talking to his wife. And he's like, Gia, this is whack. So that's how acid was kind of like brought out into the big wide world. And it didn't really fully catch on until like a little while later. But this day, not Acid Day, Bicycle Day, is celebrated every year on April 19th, right before 420, most active weekend of the year in the Bay Area, as a celebration of the discovery of LSD. So from a chemicals perspective, LSD is a serotonin agonist. It increases the effects of serotonin. However, it doesn't do it in the way that something like MDMA would. It doesn't like release a bunch of serotonin. Instead, it kind of just sticks itself in the receptor and pulls it over its head like a blanket and hangs out for a while. And we're still not exactly positive, to my knowledge, how this exerts the effects that it does. LSD is also known to be a dopamine agonist, and we know that dopamine influences reward and motor control, which might make it a little bit more obvious why LSD often makes people feel a little bit more motivated to be productive when they microdose, and also might be a glutamate agonist. This is still kind of something, to my knowledge again, that we're in the process of figuring out. So we can paint this picture here of a drug that tweaks your sensory perception, because it's not necessarily dumping serotonin, making you feel really good, even though it does sometimes make you feel really nice. But it's just changing things. It's changing how your body processes this perceptual neurotransmitter. And then in terms of dopamine agonism, it's increasing the reward found in everyday things, which is part of the reason that someone that's tripping might look at like an animatronic dinosaur and be like, that is amazing, like something that they would have seen before. And it has novel value. And that's something we'll see with a lot of psychedelics, is that they have a tendency on a neurological level to bring novel value into things that didn't have any. So later we'll look at a study that actually showed that people found much substantially higher value in music that they'd never heard before than they did when they were sober. So it literally just makes you more appreciative of things. Whatever that means can differ from trip to trip, though. That appreciation of things can sometimes mean that things feel more significant than they should be. And then it's also potentially dopamine or a glutamate agonist, which would make sense because remember, glutamate facilitates communication between brain and spinal cord and brain, effectively, a memory neurotransmitter. So this could explain some of the connective effects of LSD. When we look at this in your melon, right, where the magic happens, the seat of all power, the brain, we see this really interesting thing that happens where the amount of connectivity between different regions of the brain is drastically increased. And these are recent studies. I think these are from 2017 from the Beckley Institute. I'll have to check. But this area back here is your occipital cortex. This is the region of your brain that is responsible for processing imagery. And under the influence of something like LSD, the connections made between the occipital lobe of the brain and other areas are drastically increased. So we see that images hold more significance than they would otherwise, but also images are conjured based on things that have significance to you. And this is part of the reason that closed eye visuals tend to kind of blossom. You close your eyes and suddenly an image will start appearing and it will form and change. And part of the reason for this is that your brain is connecting past experiences in your life with your occipital lobe and producing images in kind. And we'll come way back to all the science behind this. I'm not going to get too into it right now, but that's a teaser. To make something like acid, this is the extremely simplified version of this. If you haven't seen Pikachu on acid, I absolutely highly recommend it. Is ergot fungus, which contains lysergic acid, which you can also make in a lab, but this fungus stuff, I don't know if you guys ever heard this, but when I was in middle school, I heard that you could strap a loaf of bread to your ceiling fan and spray it with water and leave it there for a few weeks and you would get acid fungus. So there were people in middle school that were doing that. Their parents would come into their room and be like, "What's up with the bread, son?" No one would have an answer. Then you add it with some dithylamine, bada bing, bada boom. Okay, Ray says that Internet Machine says that Albert Hoffman was researching Mediterranean squill ergot. He was looking for an analeptic, a respiratory and circulatory stimulant. My stepmom asks, or says, "Tell me you didn't do that in your room with the bread." I did not. Never put bread on our ceiling fan. Never had a ceiling fan, actually. You should know this. So in terms of adulterants, definitely the number one most problematic adulterant that we've seen in the market is 25I-N-BOM. Also, no, it does not work with bread. You can't just make acid on your ceiling fan. It's actually very difficult to make acid in general. People that know how to make it often make quite a lot of it, as we'll come back to later when we look at cults. Look at the Sunshine or the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, right? So 25I-N-BOM is a very unpredictable psychedelic, and it has a much higher dose than traditional LSD. So 25I-N-BOM will usually have a dose of like, I think it's 1,500 to 2,500 micrograms, which means that it can sometimes be in powder form, actually. And if someone gets a bag of 25I without realizing it, then they might accidentally ingest a dose that's a lot higher than it's supposed to be. If, for instance, they think they're getting something like 2CB, which is active in the milligram range, and they get 25I instead due to a baggy mix-up or a faulty vendor or illicit dealing or whatever, nice cat shark, then they might be prone to overdose. So the rule here is if it's bitter, it's a spitter. If you were all in a classroom, I would make you do this embarrassing chant repeatedly, but I can't because I don't have that power over the internet. But if it's bitter, it's a spitter. If your tab has a strong, metallic, bitter chemical taste, it is not LSD. LSD does not have taste like that. It's possible for the ink to have a little bit of taste. It's possible for the blotter to have a little bit of taste, but it's not going to make you make a face when you put it in your mouth. And if you do, it's not acid. Just be aware of that. 25I has been linked to multiple deaths, often due to hypertensive crisis, so excessively high blood pressure. And this especially was a problem between 2014 and 2017, I think were the peak years. However, we have been seeing it return on the illicit market recently, so be aware of this fact. Then there's the DOX family, which we won't get into too much in this course because it's not that common, but it does happen. DOX can include, and the X just means that you can fill in different letters for the full name of the drugs. So in the family, there might be DOC, DOI, DOE, DOM, and all of these drugs have a much longer duration than acid. So if you know someone that's like, I took this tab and I was tripping for like 2 whole days and it was harder to control and my body didn't feel that good, it might have been in the DOX family, especially if it had a metallic or bitter taste on the tab. They often also take a lot longer to kick in, like 4 or 5 hours sometimes or more to kick in. So people will think that they're not feeling anything, take more, and then bada bang, you're tripping for a long ass time. Then the last and probably less common adulterant would be the 2C family. So this can involve 2CB, 2CI, 2CE. And although many of you might not have heard of these or prior to this, they're actually more common than you might think, especially 2CB. And I need to put something about 2CB in this course because it's definitely gaining popularity again. 2CB was initially sold as a legal high known as Nexus in gas stations and head shops and sex shops, etc. And now it's criminalized because everything in America is criminalized. But yeah, we'll talk more about 2CB. I'll add something in here once I'm done with finals. But generally, the 2C family is very different from each other. It's not like 2CB and 2CC are going to be really similar in effects. However, in some cases, some of them might be more likely, I think 2CE or 25C, to be represented as LSD. Now, I know this is a lot of letters and numbers, right? Like, I feel like I'm reading off the titles of like patents and government documents, but what I want you to remember about this is that there are hundreds and hundreds of new emerging chemicals that can be put on blotter. You should test your blotter. It's not one of the most commonly adulterated drugs, to be clear. Like, acid is not nearly as commonly adulterated as something like Coke, which is fucking always adulterated for the most part. But you should still test it and teach you how to do that later. Let's look at mushrooms. These mushrooms look like nipples. I say that every single semester. So the active ingredient in mushrooms is psilocybin, or not actually active. The most psychedelic ingredient in psilocybin mushrooms is psilocybin. That's why they're known as such. And in your body, it gets broken down into psilocin, and we'll go over why that's something that's relevant to know a little bit later. So an average dose of mushrooms is between 1 and 3.5 grams. If you're doing mushrooms for the first time and you end up in a forum that says do an eighth for your first time, and an eighth is 3.5. So an eighth of Coke is 3.5 grams. An eighth of mushrooms is 3.5 grams. Don't do an eighth of mushrooms for your first time, I would say. That's not actually a beginner dose of mushrooms. You can take 1 gram and get a feel for it. Start low, go slow. Mushrooms will kick your ass if you don't respect them. They're known as, in some cases, mushies, I would say, or gooms are the next 2 most common. Sometimes they're known as caps, although this can sometimes refer to people that are literally just trying to buy the caps because there's speculation that the caps of mushrooms contain about 30% more psilocybin than the stems, but this does vary. And they're sometimes known as boomers. Okay, boomer. So the high experience is known as tripping primarily, or gooming in some cases. Never heard any of those, only shrooms. Yeah, I think a lot of these names are very regional for psychedelics, or just like within social circles, but gooms, where I'm from and in the circles that I run in, gooms or goomies is like the #1 most common way of referring to them, above shrooms even. Any reason why I threw up on what your dad recalls was 1/4 gram? I wouldn't have read that out loud if I'd known what the whole thing was going to say. That's my stepmom. I'm blushing like so much. This is so unprofessional. Come back to that. So, most commonly, I like cannot get my shit together. Most commonly, mushrooms come in the form of just like regular mushrooms, right? Psilocybin containing mushrooms. And they're usually dry because if you're eating an eighth of dried mushrooms, that's a lot less weight because you've let all the water basically evaporate out. If you have fresh mushrooms, you can eat them, but you're going to have to eat a buttload of them. So it's much more common to just like put them under a ceiling fan with a paper towel on them and let them dry out, because you can harvest your own in a lot of regions. The next most popular method of consumption is mushroom tea. And this is nice for a lot of people because, in response to the very nice question that was asked in chat, the process of breaking down mushrooms in the stomach, and the mushrooms in question in the chat were actually truffles from Amsterdam, which are sold in head shops legally. No admittance of illegal activity here. And when you break down the mushrooms in your stomach, they're mushrooms, you know, they have naturally occurring toxins in them. Your stomach doesn't love them, especially if you have IBS. Your stomach will not love mushrooms. So I'll tell you about a really cool way of kind of circumventing that nausea in a second. But a lot of people make them into tea. So the process here is generally that you brew the mushrooms in the tea for a certain amount of time, but not too long, otherwise the heat will break down the psilocin too far. And that process kind of like assists with allowing your stomach to digest it more easily. And it looks delicious too, right? And then you can also grind them up into powder, just like using a grinder, and stick them into caps, or like eat the straight powder if you hate the taste of mushrooms. Now, something I don't have in here is a slide, but for those of you that are interested in alternative non-nausea mushroom consumption methods, because these can actually be very helpful for people that like just are really struggling with nausea with mushrooms, or if you have a friend that's insisting on doing shrooms, but you know they're going to throw up all over you, tell them to do lemon tech. And lemon tech is, and TEK is what that's spelled as. A tech is basically a method of ingesting something that has been established as like an alternative. And Reddit is full of techs for all kinds of different things. But lemon tech is a really interesting workaround. Basically, you take approximately half of the dose that you would normally go for on mushrooms. You grind it up or chop it up as finely as possible, because that increases the surface area and also makes it less gross. And then you soak it in a shot of fresh squeezed lemon juice for 20 to 25 minutes. The reason that this works is that when you're breaking down psilocybin into psilocin in your body, you're using stomach acid basically, and citric acid is comparable to stomach acid. So you reduce a lot of the strain on your stomach by basically creating a little external stomach. So that breakdown process is done before you even ingest it. Shoot the shot of lemon juice, although actually you can totally strain out the gross mushroom bits and just shoot like this much lemon juice. Don't underestimate the power of lemon tech, folks. It will approximately double the potency of whatever it is that you're taking. Maybe it's not fully double sometimes. It does depend on the potency of the batch, but start low, go slow with lemon tech, because 1.8 grams of lemon tech will be an incredibly intense trip. So that makes you come up like in half the time that you normally would, and the trip itself only lasts about 3.5 hours, and then you are sober. So keep that in mind for people that really struggle with nausea with mushrooms. So for an approximate timeline, most mushroom trips, if you just eat them straight, will last between 4 and 6 hours. And with all psychedelics, you're going to feel a little bit of residual effects even after you're not fully tripping anymore. And this can sometimes just be in the form of like stomach upset, for instance. Comments in the chat say, does that work for anything other than mushrooms? Thank you. This class is worth the money. That's very nice. Thank you. That's a really interesting question. It might work with mescaline. That's worth looking into. It depends on whether or not citric acid is breaking down something in your stomach, and also whether it's the fiber content that's the issue. You could also try taking Beano before eating mushrooms, actually. That might help with the fiber digestion. There are lots of digestive tips for mushrooms. If you need help with that, let me know. Of course. So 4 to 6 hours approximately. It can take up to an hour to come up on mushrooms. I would say, generally speaking, from what I've noticed, different people will have kind of like a global come up length that they have. Like some people just have longer come ups on everything than others. Some people have really short come ups on everything. It's not always for every drug, but for certain classes of drugs. So for instance, I know someone that takes 3 hours to come up on psychedelics like every time, even though they only weigh 120 pounds. So it really can depend on the individual. Try keeping a log of how long it takes you to start feeling effects and how long you trip. I highly recommend having a journal for that. I'm going so slow. So in terms of where psilocybin comes from, we're going to do a deep dive into the actual history of psilocybin, including people like Maria Sabina and all those who have been trampled by colonialism in terms of mushrooms. Effectively, they have been distributed all across the world. Like really, psilocybin mushrooms grow in many, many places, and they're commonly picked as kind of a recreational activity in certain regions, the United States included. Huge social and cultural impact in South America in particular, although also in areas of Africa as well, and like really all over the place. But Mexico has a very long and strong history with mushrooms, as well as the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire was huge on mushrooms. There was a god of mushrooms whose name I cannot pronounce, but we'll come back to.
You put it in chat.
It's in a future lecture, so I'm not going to, because we will come around to it, and I will learn how to pronounce it correctly by then, because I've said that every semester, and it's about time.
Gotcha.
Things just stack up. Meanwhile, Albert Hofmann is the first one that actually isolated and synthesized psilocybin and psilocin. Now, we'll notice something as we go through these future slides about classical psychedelics, is that on the left, there's like the naturally occurring histories of these drugs. And then on the right, there's some older white man that has produced them in a lab. And we'll see through time that one of these things gets social acceptance and the other does not, even if they are identical. So the medicalization of these drugs is hugely tied to racialization of these drugs. Psilocybin, similar to LSD, is also a serotonin agonist, increases the effects of serotonin, and similar to LSD, pulls its kind of head in there and locks itself in the receptor so it can do its thing without dumping serotonin that way. However, it's also an indirect dopamine agonist, and I won't go into the exact way that it does that, but it kind of sneakily influences dopamine. And the reason that I'm telling you this without specifics is just to emphasize the point that even though these drugs have very similar mechanisms of action and similar effects, their mechanisms of action are slightly different. So even though they produce, generally speaking, psychedelic effects, the reason that they have very unique experiences as drugs is because they have very slight differences in how the brain processes them. So it really is kind of like picking your flavor of psychedelic, like what kind of experience do you want? So this is, again, psilocybin gets hammered off into psilocin, and psilocin is the active chemical in your body. So if you light your mushrooms on fire, you might destroy it. I don't know why you would do that. Maybe you're an arsonist and you just like have a pile of mushrooms, but that seems like a waste of name. So we've seen this before, looking inside the noodle, the melon, the seed of all power, the brain, whatever you call it, or all of them at the same time if you want to be extra. You can see this vast expansion of connections made between regions in the brain. Now, another thing that we'll come back to is that, interestingly enough, the blood flow to certain regions of the brain that are known to be contributors to depression is reduced following the use of psychedelics, specifically psilocybin. Now, the reason that this is important, aside from the obvious fact that it's showing that there's decreased activity in these regions, is that there's some evidence that people with depression have too high of a baseline amount of activity and blood flow in these particular regions of the brain. So this is huge because it gives us like an indicator of what we need to be doing to reduce depressive symptoms in people. And we're finding that psilocybin is a massively, massively effective treatment for treating resistant pre-death, like terminal cancer, depression, and anxiety in patients, with like massive results, is just giving mushrooms to people that are going to die soon. And it decreases depressive symptoms by huge amounts, and we'll come back to the real numbers in that in a little bit, and generally makes people feel more at peace with the concept of their own mortality. Who would have thought? Right, so the earth makes psilocybin, obviously. In terms of adulterants of mushrooms, I get asked this question actually fairly often, is there a way for me to test my mushrooms? Either you have shrooms or you don't. You're not going to get cut mushrooms. I'm just trying to imagine what that would look like chop it in half and like fill it with some powder and super glue it back together. And maybe that's just ignorant. Question, this is kind of a neuroscience heavy question, but do you know if increased blood flow to a part of the brain is a cause or effect of expanded brain functionality of that part? I'm trying to parse what you're saying. Increased blood flow to the part of the brain is a cause or effect. I'm not sure I'm really fully understanding the question that you're asking. Do you think that you could rephrase it, and I'll check back on that in a minute? Like, if more blood is flowing there, is that because it's functioning more? I believe that the answer is generally like yes, because a lot of regions that are responsible for depressive and anxious activity are often shown on brain scans to have too much blood flow. So when you have decreased blood flow there following the administration of psilocybin, that indicates that those regions of the brain are going to be less hyperactive, less hypervigilant than they were before. Does that kind of answer your question? Again, remember, we're going to come back to the more sciencey part of this later in the course. Okay, I'm going to move on. So non-psilocybin mushrooms can sometimes be sold as psilocybin mushrooms. That just kind of sucks, honestly. Make sure that you are looking up what these different kinds of mushrooms look like. There are different strains of mushrooms, like golden teachers, etc. Penis envy is one of them. And there are some minor differences to the strains. Some people swear that they can really tell and feel it. Some people swear that there's a difference in psilocybin content. I can't tell you. Go to shroomery.org and go to town. It's great. It's a lot of fun on there. If someone sells you a capsule with like 20 milligrams of powder in it, like it's like a quarter full, and they're like, this is powdered mushrooms, it's not, because if it were powdered mushrooms, you'd have to eat like 10 of these capsules and they'd be full. If someone does sell you something that they claim is powdered mushrooms, more likely it's something called 4-ACO-DMT. And this isn't just like, oh, well, someone might give you MDMA in your Halloween candy. Like, this can happen. People can genuinely think that they're selling you powdered mushrooms, when the reality of it is that 4-ACO-DMT is what's called a functional analog of psilocybin. So technically speaking, they are approximately the same. And a lot of people really do enjoy it's called 4-ECO in layman's terms, 4-ACO-DMT, because it produces similar effects to psilocybin without having the kind of fibrous breakdown and the GI upset. But there is also some kind of like social pushback, because it's thought that part of the experience of mushrooms is so special in comparison with other drugs because they're not synthesized, because they are a naturally occurring substance. And we'll kind of come back to that, because that's a really interesting point of comparison, right? Like, that's really a big question, is does this drug have a different effect if it's natural versus just like pulling the single chemical from it and synthesizing it? Now, looking at mescaline, oh good, we're up to them. So mescaline is another naturally occurring psychedelic, and this is less common than psilocybin or LSD, but it's prevalent in a lot of different kinds of plants, actually. The standard dose of mescaline is 200 to 300 milligrams. So that's approximately, I would say, like 1.5 full gelatin capsules, like of small size, of powder. It's like crystal, it can be ground into powder. Otherwise known as mescalito, it's found in peyote and San Pedro and the Peruvian torch. It's just known as tripping when you ingest it. Just so people know, in the chat, Ray says, I would honestly say it could be either of these things. For example, if someone is genetically predisposed to it, it would be the cause. But in a case where there is a traumatic experience, it might be the effect. It would be hard to say. So the forms that mescaline can come in include peyote buttons. And these things are small, and we'll come back to peyote again, like I promised last time, later, because that is a really kind of hot button topic at psychedelics. There's a lot to unpack with peyote. Then there's the San Pedro cactus, which grows wild all over the Southwest United States, and people don't realize that you can trick balls if you stew it down on your stove. The Peruvian torch is like the chodi version of the San Pedro cactus. And then there's mescaline powder. It's synthetic or it's extracted. So you can either create it in a lab, just like on its own, or you can pull it from the plant itself and then do your thing with it. these are the Arrowwood designations for how long mescaline lasts, and I think they're wrong. Generally speaking, the reports of mescaline are closer to 11 hours. It's an experience that's about the same length as LSD, if not a little bit longer. And mescaline usually takes like 1 to 3 hours to come up on. So this is another thing that people do where they think that they're fully tripping, they take more, and then they're just like, their ass is blasted. So mescaline is a very long drug experience. Now, this is really something that we'll delve into in further detail later, is the relationship that mescaline has with indigenous populations, like particularly native populations in the United States and indigenous populations in northern Mexico. And just like this is a teaser of that, we'll come back to it. On a chemical level, similar to other drugs, it is also a serotonin agonist, but we don't really know what it does beyond that, to my knowledge so far. Mescaline is one of the less studied substances, and I think personally that this is in part related to the fact that it has been medicalized, or it has not been medicalized in the way that other naturally occurring psychedelics have been. LSD really took off because it was synthesized in a lab and came in this like very drug-like form that made it more passable as something that was recreation or medicine, whereas naturally occurring substances like mescaline are often heavily demonized because of the associated dirtiness that comes with eating a plant and getting high. Now, you can brew it down in your stove and it looks like foamy green Shrek shit right there. Then you can pop it into a French press and press out all of the liquid, and then you have your extracted mescaline crystals. Now, the process of doing this is apparently actually not that difficult. So really, the main thing to be mindful of is the fact that you usually will have to brew down quite a bit of cactus to make this happen and do it properly. Mescaline grows all over the place, but I would say predominantly in northern Mexico is where this is. Lophophora is peyote. These are different kinds of peyote buttons. So peyote is all over northern Mexico and in some regions of the Southwest United States. And then the other kinds of naturally occurring mescaline are really all over South America and the Southwestern United States as well. In terms of adulterants, I would say that the 2C family is the most common adulterant of mescaline. Let me make this clear. If you're told by your random street dealer that they're selling you mescaline, they're probably not, because no one has mescaline. It's generally, I would say, the kind of a crystalline substance where only a small subset of communities has access to it. And if they do, it's generally pretty reliable and pretty well understood by those communities. Not always. Take that with a grain of salt. But you're generally not going to find a drug dealer that just has mescaline on hand. It's just not very common. Mescaline is known for being a lot more giggly than other psychedelics, very rainbowy. But yeah, be always wary of, I've actually gotten mescaline as the adulterant, not what I was looking for. That's a really interesting move on your dealer's part. That's strange. You could probably jack prices for mescaline because it's so uncommon and people really look for it. But most often, if you're going to be sold mescaline, you can kind of see back here that these like kind of chunky crystalline structures are the product of an extraction, and you can see how 2CI powder, for instance, would look very similar to that, like a chunkier, a less washed, a less processed version of that crystal. Depending on what the 2C family drug is, it's just going to be kind of a different psychedelic drug experience that might feel a little bit less physically comfortable than mescaline, a little bit less giggly, and will probably not last quite as long. So make sure to test it first, as with everything. And then the last thing we'll look at is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And DMT is a small dose, right? It's 15 to 60 milligrams, which I would say is between like 20% and 30%, 40% of a gel cap approximately. So it's not very much, like it's a small amount of crystal, but you smoke DMT. You don't eat it unless you put it in a certain form that will cover. It's known as Dimitri in some cases. It's known as businessman's trip, again, like I mentioned prior, because in the 70s, people would step out of their corporate offices on their lunch breaks, smoke some DMT, go visit the machine elves, and then come back to Earth and quit their job to go live under a bridge. Just kidding. Kind of. I think that actually did happen a couple times. Blasting off, tripping, entering the void are all words for it. The void is a very particular phrase used for DMT specifically of all of the naturally occurring, or all of the classical psychedelics. So it often comes in crystalline form, most predominantly in crystalline form, although you can also get it in kind of a yellowish or off-white powder form that is often described as smelling very much like shoe leather, very distinctly like new shoes. Or you can get DMT in the form of ayahuasca, and we'll return to what ayahuasca is comprised of, but as a preliminary understanding, ayahuasca is a plant brew, and DMT is a naturally occurring substance. It's produced in small quantities in the human brain. It's not enough quantities to actually do anything, as far as we know. But it's also produced in many plants and animals, in fact, as well. So there are naturally occurring DMT plants, particularly in South America, that can be harvested and brewed with naturally occurring MAOI. So things like Syrian rue and passion flower are naturally occurring MAOIs. So interesting, right? Thinking about how these antidepressants that we have prescribed in modern day life might have actually been ingested in the form of plants for centuries before we even had the idea of antidepressants in the first place. Just eat some Syrian rue and you feel a little bit better. And that's all we have time for today. So next time we will return to finishing psychedelics and then move on to MDMA, ecstasy, Molly, and MDMA-like substances. Thank you guys for tuning into DrugsCo. Oh yeah, of course. Welcome for doing this during finals. I fully forgot about it until like 8:56. As I told people. All right, Ray, you can cut